Rick Wakeman's album from 1973, The Six Wives of Henry VIII, is of course one of the classic recordings of instrumental progressive rock. In this episode, I'm going to talk a bit about the circumstances that led to the making of the album and go into some detail about the making of the album itself. Rick Wakeman joined Yes in August of 1971 during the sessions for Yes's fourth album, Fragile. And Wakeman participated in writing two of the cornerstone songs from Fragile, South Side of the Sky and Heart of the Sunrise. In particular, we've discussed the composition of Heart of the Sunrise at length in an earlier episode of this series. Upon completing work on those tracks, Rick Wakeman found that he could not be credited for his co-authorship of the two songs. This had to do not with artistic license, but with economics. Prior to joining Yes, Rick Wakeman had been a member of the Strawbs, who were signed not to Atlantic Records, Yes's label, but to A&M Records. A&M had a publishing deal with the Strawbs to which Wakeman was bound. His publishing was handled by Rondor Music, the in-house publishing corporation of A&M Records. And Yes's manager, Brian Lane, realized that if Wakeman were to be credited for his work on Heart of the Sunrise and South Side of the Sky, that it would impact the amount of publishing royalties that the other members of Yes who participated in those songs would receive. Yes's publishing at the time was owned by Atlantic's in-house publishing arm, Cotillion Music. In order to deal with this situation, Brian Lane took Wakeman aside and said, "Well, we can't really take care of you right now, Rick. We'll deal with this later. We'll find a way to compensate you properly." At least according to Wakeman, that compensation didn't come until many years afterwards. And it frustrated Wakeman that he wasn't going to receive royalties for these tunes, because part of the reason that he had joined Yes and not David Bowie's band, the Spiders from Mars, from whom he'd also received an offer, was that Wakeman had believed that he would have more creative opportunity with Yes, including the ability to write or co-write songs and to share in publishing. This left a bad taste in Rick's mouth, as you might expect. As it happened, during Yes's tour for the Fragile album, Brian Lane received a message from the co-owner of A&M Records, Jerry Moss, requesting a meeting with Wakeman. In addition to owning the Strawbs publishing, A&M Records also held options with Wakeman as a former member of the Strawbs on the ability to record solo albums. And with Wakeman now having a prominent role in Yes, Jerry Moss was interested in potentially exercising that option. Moss and Wakeman met, and the result was that Rick Wakeman signed a 5-album contract with A&M Records, with some 20,000 pounds of payment guaranteed for purposes of covering recording costs for making the 5 albums contracted. Wakeman received 4,000 pounds of that 20,000 up front, promising Moss that he would begin work on a first solo album. Prior to making his agreement with Moss, Wakeman had not planned on pursuing a solo album, and more to the point, he was not a singer, nor at this time a lyricist, so he was, at least at the outset, a bit hamstrung trying to identify what he could do to satisfy his contract with A&M. But with the contract now in hand, Wakeman began working in earnest on song ideas in the last months of 1971 and into early 1972. In early 1972, Yes was still busy touring to support the Fragile album, and they, of course, would later in 1972 complete work on their follow-up album, Close to the Edge, which they would support through a live tour as well. Wakeman realized fairly quickly that he was going to need to be creative in order to fit in time between Yes's recording commitments and touring dates in order to finish work on his album for A&M. He began booking studio time in February of 1972. By this time, Wakeman did not yet have a title for his album, but had begun putting some song ideas together. Wakeman ultimately came up with a theme for his album in March of 1972 while on the road with Yes, touring to support Fragile in Virginia in the United States. Wakeman, at an airport bookshop, picked up a book to read on the plane by the author Nancy Bryson Morrison called The Private Life of Henry VIII. And upon reading this book and ultimately several others on the subject, Wakeman became enamored of the idea of using Henry VIII and his six wives as the theme behind which his solo album would be based. But this was already after sessions for the album had begun. The songs that would comprise what ultimately became known as The Six Wives of Henry VIII were recorded in two segments of time, with the first three songs, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour, recorded in the first half of 1972, and the remaining three songs recorded in October of that year. Part of what marks Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour as having come from the earliest sessions for the album is that Yes's drummer, Bill Bruford, participated in all three of those selections. He plays drums on Catherine of Aragon and on Anne Boleyn, and provided various recording ideas to Rick Wakeman on Jane Seymour prior to his departing Yes in mid-July of 1972 to join King Crimson. Catherine of Aragon is constructed of four distinct parts of recording. The first and fourth, last part of the song feature a band anchored by the various members of Yes. Joining Wakeman on this track are Steve Howe on guitar, Chris Squire on bass, and Bill Bruford, as mentioned, on drums. The second of the four sections of the song is a mini Moog synthesizer solo, which transitions into a piece very ethereal in nature and held down by wordless vocals, provided by Wakeman's friend, the late Vicki Brown, and a group of background singers, including Barry St. John and Liza Strike, along with Wakeman's good friend and occasional drinking buddy, guitarist Mike Egan, and the session bassist Les Hurdle. Egan, Hurdle, Bruford, and the backing singers also recorded Anne Boleyn at about the same time. Jane Seymour is an interesting track in that it is recorded largely on location at a church in London, St. Giles without Cripplegate, featuring the church's pipe organ. The organ at St. Giles was used not only on Jane Seymour, but also for providing the pipe organ sequence in the I Get Up, I Get Down movement of Yes's Close to the Edge, recorded in June of 1972. So it's likely that Jane Seymour and that portion of Close to the Edge were recorded at St. Giles at about that same time, if not at the same session. In addition to the pipe organ on Jane Seymour, Wakeman also plays a Thomas Goff harpsichord, and there is a drum sequence overdubbed as well, which apparently was Bill Bruford's idea, but is credited on the album, not to Bruford, but to his replacement in Yes, Alan White. The three remaining songs on the album, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, and Anne of Cleves, were likely recorded in October. The common links between those string songs are Rick Wakeman and his friend, the percussionist Frank Riccati. Catherine Howard is, in addition to Wakeman and Riccati, recorded by members of the Strawbs. Wakeman, in writing this song, believed that a banjo or an instrument capable of producing sitar-like tones would be a good fit for the arrangement, and he remembered that Dave Cousins, the Strawbs leader, was capable on the banjo, and so Cousins, along with the Strawbs bassist Chaz Cronk and their guitarist Dave Lambert, were invited to participate in the sessions for this song. Catherine Parr and Anne of Cleves were held down by a different band, including the guitarist Mike Egan, along with bassist Dave Wintour, and Yes's drummer Alan White. It had initially been planned that a seventh song for the album, devoted to Henry VIII himself, would be recorded. That song was called Defender of the Faith. Ultimately, Defender of the Faith was not recorded for several reasons. As we mentioned, Wakeman needed to fit in his recording sessions for the album in between Yes's commitments, and Yes had time on the road supporting Close to the Edge booked beginning in November of 1972. So his time for recording was limited to the month of October. It was also, due to these time limitations, difficult for Wakeman to find quality studios at which to do the recording for the album. Also, finances were becoming an issue. While Jerry Moss at A&M had given Rick Wakeman a £4,000 advance to record the album, by virtue of the studio time and various musicians that needed to be hired in order to create the album, Wakeman had gone significantly over budget. His recording budget had ballooned by this point to about £25,000. So recording that last track dedicated to Henry VIII for the album was, at this point, just not practical. The story of how A&M Records reacted when Rick Wakeman presented The Six Wives of Henry VIII to them is well known, and I won't go too deeply into it here other than to say that it was not what they expected. The executives at A&M were expecting a conventional album with shorter songs and with vocals, and were not impressed at Wakeman's fledgling attempt at symphonic rock. They thought that, to be blunt, they had thrown their money away. Wakeman did find two friendly promoters in London that worked with him to promote the album wherever possible within the UK. But A&M, upon hearing the album, actually cut Wakeman's budget for album artwork. The infamous photo from Madame Tussauds on the cover of The Six Wives of Henry VIII, with the wax statue of Richard Nixon visible in the background, is a result perhaps of the cut in budget there. Wakeman, however, was lucky upon release of the album due to a scheduling issue that took place on British television. To promote the album, Rick Wakeman contracted for a British television appearance, which was, as luck would have it, scheduled opposite a documentary of the life and career of Andy Warhol, which was scheduled on a different BBC channel. It was decided last minute that the Warhol documentary would not be shown for language and moral reasons, rerouting a lot of the potential audience from the Warhol documentary to Rick Wakeman's performance of the Six Wives album, which made the public far more aware of the album out of the gate, where, as a result of the all-instrumental flavor of the album, A&M's executives initially thought they would be happy to sell 12 to 15,000 copies of the album. Within the first couple of months of release, Six Wives had sold over 30,000 copies in the UK alone. Ultimately, the album was certified as gold in the United States, reaching number 30 in the States on the US Billboard charts, and number 7 in England and put Wakeman's solo career off to a terrific start. So much so that when the movie of Yes's Close to the Edge tour, Yes Songs, was released, many of the movie posters showed Wakeman's name in far larger print than those of the other members of Yes. I somehow can't imagine that this was something that was very well received by the other members of the band, but that's perhaps a story for another episode. Thanks for joining us as always. Hope you enjoyed this one. If you liked the episode, of course, please click like. And if you're not a subscriber to Progpaganda yet, of course, please do that as well. We have a wealth of material to share with you and much more planned in the future. You take good care, and we'll be in touch. Bye-bye.